It's strange how the most tranquil places can betray you. I'd always thought the desert, with its stillness and vastness, was a sanctuary. A place where you could breathe freely and let the world fade away. That was before Camp Verde. Before the night, everything I believed about solitude turned into something I could never explain, let alone forget. I parked my RV at a campsite tucked away from the main road. It wasn't an official site, just a quiet patch of earth by a creek that had long since dried up. The February air was cold and sharp, and the horizon stretched endlessly under a sky so clear it felt like you could fall into the stars. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I spent the first few hours setting up. The silence out there wasn't just silence, it was oppressive. No distant hum of traffic, no rustling of leaves, no chirping crickets. Just the eerie, all-encompassing void of sound. It pressed down on me like an invisible weight. By the time I started a fire, the feeling had begun. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. It's normal, I told myself, to feel a little on edge when you're miles away from anyone. But it wasn't just the usual unease that comes with isolation. This was sharper, deeper, a sensation that crawled under my skin and whispered that I wasn't alone. The first time I saw her, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I had been staring into the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle, when something moved in the corner of my vision. I turned my head, expecting to see a branch swaying, or maybe a shadow cast by the firelight. Instead, I saw her. An old woman standing just beyond the firelight's reach. She was still, impossibly still, like a statue carved from shadow. Her face was pale, almost glowing, framed by thin, wispy hair that clung to her skull like cobwebs. She wore a long, dark dress that billowed slightly in the breeze I couldn't feel. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound steady. She didn't move. Didn't even flinch. I rose from my chair, the crunch of gravel under my boots sounding deafening in the silence. "Mom, are you lost? Do you need help?" Her head tilted slightly, just enough to make the gesture unnatural. Her eyes dark and empty fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Then, as if someone had hit a switch, she was gone. Not gone as in she turned and walked away. Gone as in 1 second she was there, and the next she wasn't. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where she had been. My mind raced with explanations, one of them satisfying. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow from the fire playing with my eyes. Or maybe I had nodded off for a second and dreamed her. But deep down, I knew better. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was tired, that the isolation was messing with my head. I doused the fire and climbed into the RV, locking the doors behind me. The inside felt small and claustrophobic, the walls closing in as I tried to convince myself I was safe. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the RV, every whisper of wind against the windows, made my heart race. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling a loose piece of metal, but it wasn't random enough for that. The taps came in 3 tap, 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 followed by a pause. Then again tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the door. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, straining to hear. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, though I didn't really believe it. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly as I moved toward the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. Just the tapping, summoning every ounce of courage I had. I unlocked the door and yanked it open, shining the flashlight into the darkness. No one was there, but the ground was different. Earlier, it had been smooth, undisturbed dirt. Now, it was covered in footprints. Bare footprints. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, my hands trembling. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. I sat there, flashlight clutched in one hand, a kitchen knife in the other, waiting for morning to come. But the night wasn't done with me yet. Around 3 a.m., the tapping started again. This time, it wasn't just at the door. It was at the windows too, soft, deliberate, coming from all sides of the RV. Tap, tap, tap. It was as if whoever or whatever it was wanted me to know I couldn't escape. I crouched on the floor, trying to stay out of sight, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. That's when I heard the whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own panicked breathing. But it grew louder, clearer. A woman's voice, speaking words I couldn't understand. The tone wasn't angry or pleading, it was cold, detached, like someone reciting a list of facts. I clamped my hands over my ears, rocking back and forth, praying for it to stop. And then, it did. Silence. The kind of silence that's worse than noise because it feels like something is holding its breath, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that, curled up on the floor, too terrified to move. Eventually, the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, chasing away the darkness. When I finally stepped outside, the footprints were everywhere, circling the RV in chaotic patterns. And on the window, scrawled in the condensation, was a single word. Mine. I didn't stay to pack. I didn't care about the campfire ring, the folding chair, or the food I'd left in the cooler. I got into the RV and drove, not stopping until I was miles away from Camp Verde. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was some elaborate prank or a vivid nightmare. But every time I close my eyes, I see her, standing there in the shadows, watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that I will never truly be alone again. My name is Tom Wilkins. I have always had a fascination with the unexplained, though I never thought I'd find myself tangled in one of its dark threads. Years ago, I worked for a small publication in New England, covering local history and folklore. It was during the time I stumbled across the story of Paula Jean Weldon. Or rather, it stumbled across me. I hadn't set out to investigate her disappearance. I was simply looking for material, an old legend, a ghost story, something that would fill my weekly column. But once I began digging into her case, it consumed me. There was something about her, about the way she vanished, that got under my skin. And by the time I set foot on the long trail in Vermont, retracing her steps, I was no longer just a curious journalist. I was something else, someone desperate to find answers, even if they meant confronting something I didn't understand. It was December 1st, 1946. Paula Jean Weldon, an 18-year-old sophomore at Bennington College, had decided to take a hike along the long trail. She was smart, driven, and fiercely independent, qualities I came to admire as I pored over old police reports and interviewed those who still remembered her. That Sunday afternoon, she left campus wearing a red jacket, jeans, and sneakers. It wasn't the kind of attire you'd expect for hiking in the Vermont wilderness in late autumn. But Paula wasn't known for backing down from a challenge. Witnesses saw her walking toward the trailhead. She seemed cheerful, carefree even. A local couple, the Rileys, claimed they had seen her a few miles into the trail. She'd asked them how far it went, and they told her about the summit up ahead. They were the last people to see her alive, or at all. When Paula didn't return to campus that evening, her roommates assumed she'd simply lost track of time. But when another night passed without a word, panic set in. Search parties combed the trail, helicopters scanned the dense forest from above, and bloodhounds were brought in to track her scent. Nothing. No footprints, no articles of clothing, no sign she'd ever been there beyond those brief sightings. Paula Weldon had vanished. It was this chilling void, the complete lack of answers, that drew me to the case. By the time I started my research in the late 1970s, her disappearance had become a cold case, relegated to history books and whispered rumors. Some believed she'd fallen victim to foul play. Others whispered about the supernatural, the so-called Bennington Triangle, where strange disappearances were said to happen. I didn't believe in any of that. Not at first. The Long Trail is one of the oldest hiking paths in the United States, winding through Vermont's Green Mountains for over 270 miles. I arrived in early December, the same time of year Paula disappeared. The weather was bitterly cold, and a thin layer of snow covered the ground. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you feel like you're being watched. I retraced Paula's route, starting from the trailhead near Bennington. It wasn't long before I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything concrete, just a sense that I wasn't alone. The deeper I went into the woods, the stronger it grew. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I had been reading about her disappearance for weeks, immersing myself in every detail. But when the sun began to set and the shadows grew longer, that feeling of unease became impossible to ignore. About 5 miles into the trail, I came across an old, dilapidated cabin. It wasn't on any map, and it didn't look like it had been used in decades. The door hung loosely on its hinges, and the windows were shattered, their jagged edges glinting in the fading light. I don't know why I went inside. Curiosity, maybe. Or something else. Something I couldn't quite name. The air inside was heavy, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. In one corner, I found an old, rusted stove, and in another, a pile of rotting wood that might have once been a bed. And then I saw it. A flash of red, half buried under the debris. My heart stopped. I reached down and pulled it free. It was a piece of fabric, torn and faded, but unmistakably red. The same red as Paula's jacket. As I stood there, clutching that scrap of fabric, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. There was a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, like the whisper of wind through the trees. But it wasn't the wind. It was a voice. I turned toward the doorway, expecting to see someone there. But there was no one. Only the darkening forest and the faint rustle of leaves. I told myself I was imagining things. I shoved the fabric into my pocket and stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. That's when I saw them shadows moving among the trees. They weren't shaped like animals or people. They were wrong, twisted, and they didn't move with the rhythm of the wind. I turned and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, my flashlight bouncing wildly in the darkness. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I stayed at a small motel in town. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows, heard the whispers. And then there were the dreams. In one, I was back on the trail, walking deeper and deeper into the woods. I could hear someone calling my name, their voice faint and desperate. "Tom, help me." I woke in a cold sweat, my hands trembling. But the worst part wasn't the dream itself. It was the feeling that it wasn't a dream at all. That somehow, Paula was out there calling for help. The next day, I went into town to talk to some of the locals. Most of them were tight-lipped, unwilling to discuss Paula's disappearance. But one man, an old-timer named Henry, agreed to speak with me. "She's not the only one, you know," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "People have been disappearing around here for years. It's the woods. They're different." "Different how?" I asked. He looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Fear? Pity? "You shouldn't have gone out there," he said. "Sometimes the woods take people, and they don't give them back." Despite his warning, I couldn't stay away. Something about that fabric, those shadows, kept pulling me back. I returned to the trail, this time determined to find answers. I hiked further than before, deeper into the wilderness. The whispers started again, louder now, more insistent. I tried to ignore them, but they seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding me. And then I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But as I got closer, I realized it was a woman, standing just off the trail. She was wearing a red jacket, her blonde hair glowing in the faint sunlight. "Paula," I whispered. She turned toward me, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes were empty, her face pale and gaunt. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. And then she was gone, disappearing into the shadows. I don't remember much about how I got out of the woods. Just flashes trees blurring past, the sound of my own ragged breathing, the whispers growing louder and louder. When I finally stumbled back to my car, I felt like it aged 10 years. I didn't go back to the long trail after that. I don't remember much about how I got out of the woods. Just flashes trees blurring past, the sound of my own ragged breathing, the whispers growing louder and louder. When I finally stumbled back to my car, I felt like it'd aged 10 years. I didn't go back to the long trail after that. I never found out what happened to Paula Jean Weldon. Maybe no one ever will. But I know one thing for sure. There's something in those woods. Something dark and hungry. If you ever find yourself on the long trail, be careful. And if you hear someone calling your name, no matter how familiar it sounds, don't answer. I have never been one for ghost stories. I always chalked them up to superstition or overactive imaginations. But what happened to me and my wife at Palo Duro Canyon last fall changed everything. I haven't told many people about it, mainly because I don't want to relive it. But maybe writing it down will help. We had been planning the trip for months. Rachel, my wife, had been dying to take the RV out for a weekend, and the weather was perfect. Palo Duro Canyon was supposed to be breathtaking that time of year. Crisp autumn air, burnt orange foliage, and just enough chill at night to make campfires worthwhile. We pulled into the campground late Friday afternoon. The sun was dipping below the canyon rim, casting long shadows over the rugged terrain. There weren't many other campers around, just a few scattered RVs and tents in the distance. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Rachel and I set up our site, grilled some burgers, and sat by the fire as the stars blinked into the darkening sky. The wind whispered through the canyon walls, carrying a faint, distant echo that seemed to shift direction every few moments. Rachel joked that it sounded like someone humming. I brushed it off, told her it was probably just the wind playing tricks. By midnight, we crawled into the RV, both exhausted from the drive and a little buzzed from the wine. Rachel fell asleep almost instantly. I lay awake, listening to the sounds outside. The crackling fire had dwindled to glowing embers, and the hum of the wind was now punctuated by something else. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal. Maybe a coyote or a deer sniffing around the site. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It circled the RV, slow and steady. Gravel crunched under each step, one after another, like someone pacing. I didn't want to wake Rachel. She had a tendency to panic, and I figured it would pass. But after 15 minutes of that slow, relentless circling, I couldn't take it anymore. I quietly slid out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and peeked through the small window by the kitchenette. Nothing. The firelight barely reached the edge of the RV. But beyond that, there was just darkness. I opened the door, stepped outside, and shined the flashlight around the site. The beam cut through the night, illuminating the trees and the empty picnic table. Still, nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting for something, anything to emerge from the shadows. But the only sound was the wind scraping against the canyon walls. Finally, I locked the RV and climbed back into bed, telling myself it was just my imagination. I woke up to Rachel screaming. She was standing by the RV door, her hand trembling as she pointed at the window. The glass was smeared with handprints, long, pale smudges that stretched across the entire pane. Dozens of them. Some small, like a child's. Others larger, more defined. But they were everywhere, crisscrossing in patterns that made no sense. Did you do this? Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper, but I could hear the terror in it. Why would I do that? I snapped, stepping closer to inspect the prints. They weren't ours. The smears were greasy, almost translucent, as if the hands that made them were damp. I pressed my palm against one, measuring the size. It was larger than mine by at least an inch. I checked the door. Locked. Same with the windows. There was no sign of forced entry. Whoever had left those prints had done it from the outside. But there were no footprints in the dirt beneath the window. Nothing. Rachel wanted to leave immediately. I can't blame her. But I convinced her to stay, at least until sunrise. We spent the next few hours huddled together, every creak of the RV making us jump. When the first light bled over the canyon, I stepped outside again. The handprints were gone. Not just faded or washed away. Gone. As if they had never been there at all. Rachel swore up and down that she hadn't imagined them, and I knew better than to doubt her. We packed up and left that morning, cutting our trip short. Weeks passed, and we tried to forget about it. But Palo Duro stayed with us. Rachel refused to camp anymore, and I started triple-checking the locks at night. Sometimes, when the wind picks up, I hear footsteps outside our house. I tell myself it's nothing. But some nights, when I look out the window, I swear I see faint smudges on the glass. They're not there in the morning. I never used to believe in the supernatural. Not really. I'd laugh at ghost stories, shake my head at those YouTube videos of shadowy figures caught on grainy security cameras. I always figured there was a logical explanation for everything, until last October. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. I took my RV out to Sam Houston National Forest, away from the noise, away from work and responsibilities. Just me, a stack of books, and 2 cases of beer. I even left my phone in the glove compartment, turned off. I told myself I wanted peace, but if I'm honest, I needed the isolation. Life had been heavy lately, and I thought maybe a few days alone in the woods would help me clear my head. The spot I found was perfect. Remote, tucked about 25 miles north of Huntsville, past the usual trails. I had to navigate some winding dirt roads to get there. But by the time I pulled into the clearing, the sky was blushing orange with the sunset. Tall pines loomed around me, the kind that seemed to watch you when the wind blew just right. It felt secluded, exactly what I wanted. I set up camp, unfolded my lawn chair, and watched the sky darken. The fire crackled beside me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. I should have left after that first night. I slept deeply at first, wrapped in the quiet hum of the RV heater. But around 3 a.m., something woke me. I couldn't place what it was. I just sat up in bed, feeling like someone had whispered my name. The RV was still, and outside the window, the trees swayed gently under the moonlight. I shook it off as a dream, grabbed a drink of water from the kitchenette, and lay back down. That's when I heard it. Soft, distant at first, like the wind through the trees. But it wasn't the wind. Wind doesn't whisper in circles around an RV. It was faint, just beyond the edge of hearing, but unmistakable. The soft cadence of voices. I froze, straining to make out the words, but they were too quiet. Just a murmur, moving around the RV. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe another camper somewhere nearby. Maybe a trick of the wind. But there was no one else out there. I forced myself to lie down, pulling the blanket up to my chin like a kid hiding from the monsters under the bed. I don't remember falling asleep, but the next thing I knew, the sun was pouring through the small window above me, and everything felt normal again. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I spent the day hiking along the trails, pushing the night from my mind. By noon, I almost convinced myself it was just my imagination. Almost. That night, the whispers came back. Louder this time. I woke up, heart racing, and sat perfectly still in the dark. The voices were right outside the RV, moving from window to window. They sounded like children, giggling, murmuring just below their breath. I sat there for nearly an hour, too afraid to move. I kept expecting to see faces press against the fogged glass, but nothing appeared. The whispers faded just before dawn. I told myself I'd imagined it. I was wrong. The next night, things escalated. I woke at 3:13 a.m. I know because I glanced at the small clock on the stove as I sat up. The RV felt colder than usual, like someone had left the door open, but it was locked tight. And then I saw them. Handprints. Tiny, child-sized handprints trailing across the fogged glass of the windshield. I stared at them, breath shallow, heart hammering against my ribs. I hadn't moved the RV since I parked. No one had been out there. And yet, there they were, clear as day. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on with trembling fingers, and scanned the inside of the RV. Nothing. I cracked open the door, the cold air biting at my skin as I shone the light around the clearing. The ground was soft from the dew, but there were no footprints. No signs that anyone had been near the RV. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The following day, I debated leaving, but something kept me there. Call it pride or curiosity. I convinced myself to stay just one more night. I shouldn't have. I fell asleep around midnight, fully clothed with the flashlight beside me. I told myself I wasn't scared, but I was. The whispers started right on time, just after 3 a.m. Only this time, they didn't stay outside. I woke to the sound of soft giggles inside the RV. I shot up, flashlight shaking in my grip as I swept it across the small space. The kitchenette, the door, the narrow bathroom, and then I saw the prints. Not just on the windshield, on the inside. They trailed along the glass, small and delicate, like someone had pressed their hands there while I was sleeping. I packed up at dawn. I didn't eat, didn't drink my usual morning coffee. I just drove, eyes darting to the mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see something crouched in the back seat. I didn't stop until I hit Houston. I told myself I would forget about it, that I would laugh it off in a few months. But I haven't been able to. Because last night, when I walked to my truck to grab something, I noticed the faint trace of handprints on the driver's side window. And I haven't been back to Sam Houston National Forest since